and welcome to Decarbonize, the clean energy podcast from Fresh Energy. Fresh Energy is a Minnesota nonprofit working to speed our state's transition to a clean energy economy. My name is Justin Fay, and I'm the Chief Advocacy Officer here at Fresh Energy, and also your host today. I'm excited to be joined by my colleague Brandon Isakson, Managing Director of Industry at Fresh Energy, and we've got a special guest today, Kwezi Tabaro, a Fulbright Humphrey Fellow at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Welcome to you both.
Thank you, Justin.
Yeah, thanks, Justin.
We're here today to talk about the challenging topic of mining and our transition to clean energy. But first, let's meet our guests. Kwezi, you've been collaborating with Fresh Energy throughout your Fulbright Fellowship, starting in December, I believe. So
Yes.
we're going on 6 months. Wow, time flies. Why don't you share a little bit about yourself? And for our listeners, if Kwezi sounds particularly polished, it's because he's also a radio host. Isn't that right?
Thank you, Justin. My name is Kwezi Tabaro. I'm a Fulbright H. Humphrey Fellow at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. That's at the University of Minnesota. I've been at the Humphrey School since August last year. I'm from Uganda. And throughout my year here in Minnesota and the Midwest, I'm undertaking a graduate level study in public policy. And as part of the fellowship, I'm required to do what is called a professional affiliation with an organization in Minnesota. So my professional affiliation has been with Fresh Energy since, as you rightly mentioned, December. So it's coming to 6 months. And throughout my time here, I've been doing a bit of research on the clean energy transition, mainly focusing on responsible mining for minerals critical to the energy transition. But a bit of my background, coming from Uganda, my academic background is in the natural sciences. So my undergraduate degree was in zoology and chemistry, which I finished, must have been about 10 years ago, and then spent the next 9 years working in the nonprofit space. As you mentioned rightly, I also hosted a radio show for about the same time. And this fellowship came at a critical juncture in my professional career, because I felt I was at a turning point and I needed to figure out what exactly I wanted to do. And I guess that's why I'm here.
Well, that's great. It's been such a pleasure having you at Fresh Energy, Kwezi, for the last 6 months. And I think by the time folks at home are listening to this, Kwezi will have wrapped up his time with us, which is super bittersweet. We're really going to miss you, but also just so grateful for your work contributions and the some of which we're going to talk about today on this podcast.
Thank you, Justin.
Our next guest, Brandon, hello. You're one of the newest members on the staff team here at Fresh Energy. Can you introduce yourself to folks?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. Brandon Isakson here, managing director of industry, and I grew up in Mankato, Minnesota, lifelong Minnesota resident. Went to the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus and studied economics and geology there. After school, I spent the next 13 years in the geology consulting space, and primarily focused on early stage exploration, so mineral exploration, kind of prospecting work, and definitely worked adjacent to and with a few mine sites on the development side as well. And in that space, I had a lot of opportunity to see where the markets were heading, especially with that kind of economics background. And for exploration, you're always kind of looking at where trends are heading, what materials are required for those trends, and making sure that we're looking for and sourcing those materials. So it's really relevant to this conversation and relevant to this position with Fresh Energy, because focusing on the heavy industry side of things, you can't overlook Minnesota's industry when it comes to mining, right? A long-standing history of iron mining here on the range. And it's certainly an area that we can focus on for decarbonization as well. And there's a lot of good work being done in that space, along with a few other things that we can talk about a little later in the industry space. But I'm really excited to be working with Fresh Energy and tackling some hard to abate sectors and doing some important work.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Brandon. We're just so excited about the work you've already been doing. It's been just wonderful having you on the team for what, two months now? Month and a
Yeah,
half,
just
2
about
months?
2 months. Yeah, just started April 1st. So
Uh,
yeah,
well, you've definitely hit the ground running.
great. Thanks.
Uh, let's get down to the topic at hand. So mining and the transition to clean energy. Before we jump into the conversation, though, I want to maybe lead with a disclaimer here and be very, very clear as we talk about this politically challenging and difficult, complex topic. Fresh Energy is very much in a learning phase on mining, on resource allocation needed for the clean energy transition. As such, we do not advocate, have not, and do not advocate for or against any new or existing particular project or particular mine. We're simply here to discuss the role that materials play in the energy transition. The energy transition itself is a major focus of Fresh Energy's work, that we seek as often as we can to have a holistic learning approach to our conversations and thinking about the energy transition itself. Mining is a difficult subject, has a long, difficult history, and is highly politicized, both here in Minnesota and elsewhere. Wherever it happens, it must always be considered through the lens of the community where it's located, as well as the lens of environmental impacts, especially water and air. So let's start by talking about the historical arc of Fresh Energy on mining and the energy transition. And Kwezi, I believe you've done some research into the investments in the transition to clean energy at the global level. So please, why don't you go ahead and set the stage for our conversation today?
Yeah. So as part of my research for this white paper on responsible mining, I came across a very interesting report that came out last year from Bloomberg, and the report was saying that investments in clean energy in 2024. So you're looking at all investments that could be described as going into clean energy or energy transition. These investments hit the 2 trillion mark last year. Now that figure, regardless of how big is not screaming until you get the details. It hit 2 trillion in 2024, but the investment had only reached the 1 trillion mark 3 years before. So in a space of 3 years, we've seen a 60% increase in investments going into these clean energy technologies. And the bulk of these resources are going into electrified transportation. So when we talk about electrified transportation, that's where your electric vehicles or EVs fall under, but also the associated infrastructure with that. You also have the bulk of that investment going into energy storage. So this is energy storage related to solar or other modes of electrification. And this, so far, according to the report, is the fastest growing sector in clean energy technologies. And in tying it back to responsible mining, what this essentially means is that as we work towards this clean energy future and net zero by 2050, we're increasingly going to need more materials. So we're entering into the materials age. If you look at your average EV, it contains about 6 times more materials than your conventional gas-powered car. And if you look at generation of clean energy itself, the average onshore wind farm requires somewhere in the range of 9 times more material than your old polluting coal plant. Now, this does not necessarily mean that one is better than the other, but I think the learning that we see in this is that the future in which we're headed, we're increasingly going to require more materials. Thankfully, there's a lot of this stuff Some of it available domestically here in the US, but some of it is in remote places in the world. And my research, therefore, was looking at what is available domestically and how responsibly can we source it, and for those materials that may not be available domestically, what can be done to make sure that they're incorporated into the supply chain.
Yeah, thanks, Kwezi. That really sets the stage for a really basic supply and demand discussion, right? And that's really the core of what's driving this conversation. And you touched on some of that increasing demand. And I want to also point out that we also need to keep in mind that even just with keeping up with population and societal growth, there are already growing needs for those materials regardless of the energy transition. So it's really a compounded issue when we look at it holistically. And outside of more drastic societal changes, one of the only real levers we can pull on that demand side is to focus on more readily available materials. And for instance, in the battery space, the technologies around batteries are improving all the time, and we're looking at alternatives to. We certainly see lithium-ion batteries have taken the lead in this space, and I'm not endorsing any particular technologies here, but if you look at sodium-ion or iron-air batteries, those could serve as substitutes for lithium-ion batteries, and those would have more readily available materials. When you look at lithium-ion, we're requiring nickel, cobalt, and a variety of other more challenging, more scarce resources. So, but also recognizing, again, with those technologies, sometimes those alternatives come with sacrifices in performance in certain areas. So we're keeping an eye on those technology improvements, where we can do what we can to focus our demand in spaces that are going to be more easily met on the supply side. But that's a challenging dynamic.
Yeah, and I wanted to come in there, Brandon, if you could allow me.
Yeah.
I think the opportunity in this materials world is that the number of options that are available at our disposal, and I think that's why this news of the significant investment that is going into clean energy technologies is very important. Because look at a sector like transportation. For the last perhaps 100 years, the way we've looked at the motor vehicle, I mean, it was an internal combustion engine, and the difference was in the model of the car, not necessarily in the technology that drives the car. But when you look at electric vehicles, you start talking about different battery chemistries. So it's quite possible that, and it's already happening, that an electric vehicle built in the US will have a different battery chemistry from an electric vehicle built in Europe or built in China. And this helps with energy security, because then you can focus on those materials that are easier to source, more readily available in your own country to produce a certain type of battery chemistry. So we're looking at lithium-ion batteries, or, for example, and this we'll talk about at some point in the podcast, the issue of cobalt mining. You have one country, the DRC or Congo, that produces about 60 or 70% of the world's cobalt supply. But we know that this country has been in conflict, and conflict is entangled with mining in that country. So if we want to steer away from such supply chains, the opportunities that these different battery chemistries give us is that you could pursue investments in a series of battery chemistries that don't include cobalt or don't include as much cobalt, which is an advantage we did not have, for example, with oil, with fossil fuels. Every car ran on oil, and therefore you needed to find oil regardless of where it was in the world.
Yeah, those are all really good points there, Kwezi, and that really kind of leads right into the next component of this conversation, which is really continuing to focus on that supply side. And unfortunately, as you pointed out, the reality is we do rely heavily on mining raw materials to meet those demands, right? And but quickly before we get into the mining conversation further and talk a little bit more about some specific materials in that space, it is important to recognize that, although we do rely heavily on mining, there are alternatives, right? So one of the things we touched right away is how can we reduce the demand for certain materials that are challenging, but also, on the supply side, we can also focus on recycling and reuse programs, and that's an important part of the equation. For instance, steel is the most recycled material in the world, so we already do have a legacy in recycling some metals, but other important metals and materials are not as readily recycled or not as regularly recycled in our society. So it's important to be recognizing some of those efforts that groups like Fresh Energy are taking to drive policies promoting improvements in the recycling and reuse programs. Some states are actively working on bills that would create stewardship programs for recycling and create a market for the recycling of critical materials, internal and domestic within their state. Minnesota is making some good headway in this space. We currently have an enlisted task force, a critical materials recovery advisory task force that is doing good work here in Minnesota to advise the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, specifically focusing on program opportunities that would increase the recovery of critical materials, some of those being aluminum, copper, cobalt, nickel, and silicon. So recovering some of those from end-of-life products here in Minnesota. So yeah, great to see that work being done here. Fresh Energy will continue to champion and support those kind of initiatives in whatever way we can. And we're seeing the recycling industry maturing and becoming more sophisticated. I think a lot of times when people think about metals in this space, they think of scrappers, and that's not a very sophisticated space when people think about scrapping, and there's a lot of challenges there. But we're seeing increased investment in technologies and groups that are coming up and doing good work, specifically in the batteries recycling space. We see a lot of new players putting a lot of investment into that space, and there appears to be a strong future opportunity there, but that's not without its challenges as well, right? It's a pretty nascent space, and even with the battery recycling space, some of those operators themselves would tell you that they are going to rely on raw materials for the foreseeable future for battery manufacturing, because there simply isn't a large enough volume of modern batteries at the end of their life. So there's challenges in that space and a variety of other areas that we're excited to see people working through, and again, supporting any investment in this space, because we'd like to see the recycling industry continue to scale up with increased efficiency and cost effectiveness, while also making sure that we're focusing on the clean energy consumption throughout that industry's full life cycle too. That's something that we can't forget is, mining has its challenges, but so does the recycling space, and we need to hold that space accountable for clean energy consumption too. Kwezi.
Oh yes, Brandon, I think I completely agree with you. And the reason I'm really excited about, this current age or the electric future that we're heading into is that it actually supports recycling. And I hate to make this comparison, but if you look at fossil fuels, to generate energy from fossil fuels, you have to burn them. So essentially, you start with something and then there's nothing at the end. But with an electric future, you have these materials as energy carriers. So they can deliver the energy without changing in form. So if you have a lithium battery, for example, the lithium battery can deliver the energy and still be available for use in some form at the end of its life cycle. And while initially it will be difficult for the economics of recycling to make sense, but I think as we have more of this material out of the ground, it's going to become a lot easier to recycle than to dig up new stuff. And I think that's something that is that is quite exciting. And again, unlike fossil fuels, where you tend to have continuous flows with critical materials, they can be described as being in form of stocks. So you have a chunk of something, lithium, manganese, cobalt, or any of that stuff that you can then turn into secondary products. And those products usually have a much longer lifetime. If you're looking at a solar panel, that's about 15 years. If you're looking at a wind plant, that's possibly 30 years. So these materials will tend to be in use for a much longer time than we've had in the previous age, where we're relying on fossil fuels.
Yeah, that's so important to see that future opportunity to continue alleviating the pressure from the raw materials extraction side of things, right? So, we all recognize the variety of needs for these materials throughout the energy production side, everything from generating and capturing energy to storing it and transmitting it. We need these materials. So it's great that we can be having this conversation and thinking critically about how we source those materials and making sure that we're being good stewards while doing it.
Yeah, and on a light-hearted note, Brandon, I think at some point we might have to change the definition of mining, because mining will not necessarily mean digging up stuff from the ground, but it could be digging up stuff from your trash.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Urban mining is a term
Yeah.
that we use. Certainly. Yeah. No, I think that's a great thing. And
Yeah.
I do like to use the framing of, when we're having this conversation, mining is one aspect of it, but I think really the ultimate thing, and going back to the supply and demand thing, is how are we sourcing these materials is really the big conversation, because that's going to be a changing dynamic all the time. And again, let's make sure that we're being good stewards while doing it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It's a really, really great discussion, guys. And Brandon, you made a comment earlier about, recycling industry and the need to, there's like environmental and other impacts that might be negative that need to be held to account there as well. And I would just maybe add to that, like some of the benefits, the economic benefits exist there as well too. Like you can have, good family supporting union jobs doing metal recycling. You absolutely can, have any number of kind of economic and like job both creation and retention benefits when you're able to reuse materials rather than create something new. So there is, I think, a lot of opportunities to think about kind of those like holistic economic benefits. But I want to keep us moving here and maybe sort of building on this general topic of just like the kind of broader economic impacts and really socioeconomic impacts. That's a really big issue when we're talking about mining, wherever it's being done, how that impacts different communities in different ways. Kwezi, you've done some thinking and research into this. Is there anything that you found or would want to share on just sort of like observations on the broader socioeconomic impacts of mining?
Certainly, as you rightly pointed out, mining is a sector that has had a difficult history, and especially now mining for these critical materials. So there's an interesting study that came out a few years ago that found that 54% of mineral deposits, these are critical minerals, are found either in or around indigenous communities. This was research that was carried out across the world. This makes our approach to mining even more difficult, and therefore requires us to think even more deeply, because historically these indigenous communities have been marginalized. Some of them have been dispossessed of their lands. So how do we make sure that in this journey to net zero that we do not cause even more harm? And when you look at the case of the United States, there were figures that I found quite interesting, that among the key energy transition minerals, 97% of nickel deposits, for example, 89% for copper, and 79% for lithium, 68% for cobalt. All these reserves are found within a 35-mile radius of Native American land. And you might ask a question, why is this the case? Well, some of these lands happened to be marginal agricultural land with limited other use value. So people did not choose to just go and settle in these lands that now happen to have these minerals. So what that calls upon us is to think even more critically about how do you engage with these indigenous communities, because then you have issues around land rights, water rights, access rights. And I can't claim to be an expert on US land rights or mining laws, but I think it's a very complicated and complex matter. But for me, what I found interesting was the parallels that you could draw between what is happening here in the US and what's happening across the world. These are issues that so many countries around the world are grappling with, whether it's if we stick within North America, Canada, for example, there are significant mineral reserves that are found on indigenous land. You have Chile, you have in South America, Chile, and in Australia as well, but also in many African countries where many of these tribal lands on which tribes are engaged in agriculture also happen to hold, these critical and precious minerals for the world. So what this means is that globally, I think we need to have a more sustainable approach towards this industry, but also to learn from the difficult history that this industry has been associated with, and hopefully apply some of the lessons. And I think that's the most important thing. How do we learn to do better tomorrow than we did the day before?
Absolutely. That I think I was aware of that general trend, Kwezi, but I just want to ask you again that the stat you shared, the percentage of mines that are in proximity to indigenous lands, what was that again? What was the number?
So it was about 97%
Wow.
of nickel deposits and 89%. So again, for your listeners, so when we talk about nickels, nickel, this is a crucial component in batteries. Copper, this is anything electrified in your house, in your car, has copper in it. So these are very crucial elements, and it's also a very staggering statistic and finding.
Yeah, that's stunning. It's certainly true, and I think a lot of folks who pay attention to mining issues in Minnesota will recognize that it's true locally here in our state. But I think what you're clearly saying is and demonstrating is that's true basically everywhere around the world. And I think that's an important piece of context for us to keep in mind as we have this conversation about how we're going to resource materials, and what principles and standards we're going to hold ourselves and the industries that we're supporting and helping to foster to as we do so. Thinking about Minnesota specifically, Minnesota has a well over a century's worth of mining history. Iron, the Iron Range is named for a reason. And we have a long history and a well-established industry doing iron mining. It's basically an accepted type of mining here in Minnesota. Isn't that right, Brandon?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Justin. I mean, iron mining isn't free and clear of challenges as well. As with any of these spaces in extraction, there's a lot to be looked after, especially on the environmental and social side there. But it is well established here in Minnesota, and it's interesting when we have these conversations about the energy transition. I do feel like iron and steel gets kind of left out of the conversation a little bit, and in certain circles, we certainly talk about it plenty, but it is important to recognize it's as critical as copper and some of these other items. Consider the fact that even a single 3 megawatt wind turbine requires over 300 tons of steel. It is a very big part of the energy transition. And as I mentioned earlier, the demand side for these metals is going to be increasing regardless of the energy transition as well. And we will certainly see that for structural steel and beyond. So iron continues to be an important part of the conversation. And although we have iron resources here that are world-class deposits, they also aren't particularly scarce throughout the world. So that is maybe part of why it doesn't have as much buzz when we talk about critical minerals and critical materials. And Kwezi did a good job of kind of introducing some of these critical minerals, but I thought maybe I could give a little bit of context as to what that definition really means when we're having this conversation. And so really, when we're talking about critical minerals, they're mainly raw materials that are of strategic importance. They are limited in global distribution, and they're often susceptible to supply chain disruptions. So resources like that, I mean, they've certainly been featured heavily in the media due to recent volatility in international trade. And there are a few that keep coming up in the spotlight when we talk about the energy transition. And to name just a few quick, and Kwezi already kind of introduced a few of these, but cobalt, copper, graphite, lithium, neodymium, and nickel are some of the ones that get a lot of the spotlight, like I said. And of particular importance here in Minnesota, we're certainly talking about a bit about copper, cobalt, and nickel, and some of those deposits that we have here that are world-class deposits. And they should be having the conversation, and we continue to have that conversation about, is there a path toward mining those? Is there a sustainable, responsible mining future in that space? And it's a challenging conversation because when you take a step outside of Minnesota, again, Kwezi alluded to some of the similarities that we have elsewhere, but recognizing that cobalt, like Kwezi said, the strong majority of the world's deposits in cobalt are in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Nickel is pretty much entirely focused on in Indonesia. But we also do have world-class resources of those here, but it's important to recognize that they're not widely dispersed in deposits throughout the world. So there are a few communities that are in this conversation much more than others. And it's important to recognize that you can't just go to Iowa to find some of those. You can't just go to Nebraska to find some of those. They are very localized. And that's why the conversation becomes much more critical in the areas that they exist. And I want to just kind of touch on a couple terms there. I think, again, Kwezi did a good job of kind of laying out some of what these materials are used for, and where they exist. But specifically when we talk about critical minerals, I just want to say that is a bit of a misnomer. The list of critical minerals, even as I listed them off, cobalt, graphite, copper, lithium, those are not actually minerals. Those are elements. Those are metals and other elements. So just keep that in mind if you're talking in your circles, that those are not minerals. That's a geologist in me getting on my soapbox about some of this terminology. But another one that I will, while I've got the mic, rant about is the term rare earth minerals. That can also be really misleading. And when I talk to people about that, they tend to think that these are rare elements around the world. And the reality is that term rare earth actually really only refers to those elements' positions on the periodic table. It does not actually refer to their rarity or scarcity in the world. So an example is neodymium. It is a rare earth metal because of where it lies on the periodic table, but it is not actually rare in abundance throughout the world. So just know that when these terms are floating around. And neodymium is a great example of something that is important for the energy transition. It is used for magnets, which are used in virtually every engine, every wind turbine. But it's one that is coming up in conversation right now because the strong majority of it is mined in China. And it's important to think about some of those supply chain considerations for some of these. There are good projects happening right now that are looking at non-rare earth non-rare earth magnets. So getting away, again, going back to that conversation of, are there more readily available materials that we can use as substitutes? And right now, again, there's good technology, good work happening in the space of making powerful powerful magnets without the use of neodymium or other rare earth metals.
Yeah, Brandon, speaking of interesting trends, again, in line with what I was talking about, that increasingly the definition of mining has got to change, because I was having a conversation with someone earlier on in the week, and they were telling me about this new technique that would allow us to recover critical materials like lithium from wastewater. So you could, essentially extract some of these materials from all manner of waste. So you could extract some from electronic waste. So all our used iPhone batteries and, our used car batteries. But we could extract some of these crucial elements as well from municipal waste, from industrial waste. And I think in having the conversation alongside the energy transition, I think what it allows us to do is to explore all this range of opportunities that we have, because we're not essentially advocating for one way or the other. We're not saying mining as opposed to X, Y, Z, or opposition to mining as in favor of another alternative, but to look at this range of possibilities. That one, we could dig up this stuff from the earth. There's plenty of it. We could recycle some of this material. The other thing that we often overlook is that we can also make existing appliances and equipment more efficient, so we don't need a lot of this material, which is a net saving on our end. The other thing we could do is to direct more investment into research and development that would allow us to find other newer, cleaner, more efficient ways of extracting some of these materials. Because, like you rightly mentioned, that the names might be misleading. Critical screams rare, but it doesn't necessarily mean that this stuff is hard to come by. The process of getting it might be the one that's difficult.
Absolutely. Brandon, are there some, they're building on that, are there some basic principles that we should be thinking about when we think about, mining considerations?
Yeah, there's certainly some things that we need to always be thinking about when we're evaluating any project, regardless of mining or otherwise, and thinking about that siting, thinking about the local impacts, the workforce, public health, environment, and safety, and then specifically in the mining space, again, going back to what minerals are we looking to extract? Are there substitutes? Is this imperative that we're focusing on these materials in particular here? And again, going back into the carbon intensity side, the clean energy life cycle analysis when we're looking at any one of these projects. And then the other big thing that's driving all of this is financing, right? So so there's a variety of things that we need to be looking at, and again, making sure that every project is evaluated through this whole set of principles, and making sure that they're viable, realistic, and meaningful, and that all the impacts are being considered along the way.
And it goes without saying that, just because there's viable projects that get proposed doesn't mean that we should be opening all of Minnesota up to mining. It does mean that we should be honest about, the demand for materials that are required for the things that we're advocating support for, and the implications and effects of the, securing those materials. And we should be having an ongoing conversation about all of that. Kwezi, I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about from your research on what other states are doing around critical materials recycling, mining, et cetera. Minnesota, we have a mining industry here, but we certainly can't be the only ones that are dealing with this.
Yeah, it's interesting what states are doing. And I think what the states are doing and what the United States is doing is not isolated. I think there've been changes at the global level in terms of geopolitics that have necessitated countries to start thinking more critically. Again, I use the word critically about how we source some of these materials that we deem critical to our national security or to our economies. So states have been trying to figure out ways to make use of some of the materials at the end of their life cycle. And I found interesting examples in the pieces of legislation that were coming out of places like Illinois, Washington, and Colorado. And these extended producer responsibility requirements mainly cover batteries. So they put in place regulations, or really, the A to Z of how do you handle batteries at the end of their life cycle. And can we possibly create a secondary market for end of life cycle batteries? I don't think there's any one particular state that has figured it out, but I think many states are on that progressive journey towards trying to figure out. And in the case of Minnesota, I think at the end of last year, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, the MPCA, created this 15-member task force that will advise the state on how to go about recycling of these critical materials, and whether it's possible to create a market for these recycled materials within the state. So it's still a lot of work in progress, but many states are certainly making significant moves in that direction.
Yeah, and Kwezi, I know you and I have spoken a bit about, what are some of the initiatives that can be done at a state level, or even more specific to a site or project that can help bring stakeholders and rights holders to the table. And one that we've talked about internally here is the Stillwater Mine program. It was the Good Neighbor Agreement, and it's kind of held up as a golden standard for projects and community engagement. Even outside of the mining industry, it is referenced pretty regularly. And it was designed by the Stillwater Mining Corporation in Montana, and it really engaged a variety of local representatives to be at the table, to hold the company accountable for any commitments that they've made, and giving the community a regular platform to voice concerns that they might have, whether they be environmental, social, or otherwise. And so it's good to see examples like that could be built off of and taken and applied to future programs as well. To again make sure that people have a voice, not just from the earliest permitting process at the state level, but making sure that people can engage directly with the business to keep an eye on it. There are also some international best practices being developed and built upon within the mining space in particular. One example being IRMA. It's the Initiative for Responsible Mining Assurance. It's something that has gained traction over the last decade, and just one continued example of a way that we need to be thinking globally about this problem, right? We tend to get tunnel vision on our local considerations, but it is a global thing. It's a global market, global demand that we're trying to meet here. So let's make sure that how projects are being undertaken in Africa and Asia might be looked at and handled the same way, with the same practices that we've developed in North America, that are continuing to grow and continuing to become more sophisticated. And I think Kwezi did a really good job of mentioning that a lot of these deposits are really in close proximity to indigenous communities. And the honest truth is that throughout history, to put it lightly, the relationship between mining companies and those communities has not been mutually beneficial. And there's still plenty of examples of exploitation and tone deaf operators today. But I do think we are seeing a bigger push from large mining companies to do better, and we need to continue to hold them accountable to take that further, because a shift in that sentiment can't necessarily just be attributed to goodwill from these groups. I think part of it is the pressure that they've had on them in the last decade or more. These companies have wisened up to the importance of social permitting and the massive costs of not getting that social approval. And I think that's a part of modern media and the resources that we have for communicating as a global network of stakeholders effectively. So we will continue to see that pressure put on these groups to do better, and hopefully that is taken to heart and acted upon appropriately.
On,
Yeah,
maybe
I just wanted to
go
pick
ahead.
up from there, Brandon. I think the other thing I would emphasize here is, I mean, there's also a role for international cooperation, because some of these materials that are critical to the energy transition are where they are, and there's nothing we can do about it. It's like a lottery. So it so happens that 60% of the cobalt is in the DRC, or a significant chunk of the nickel deposits are in Indonesia. So we can enhance international collaboration, because at the end of the day, what we intend to achieve in terms of our net zero targets, we're achieving it for the rest of the world and not just necessarily for the United States. So there's a lot of conversation around that, creating multiple supply chains with different countries, but also finding collaborations where possible, especially not just in mining, but even in recycling, because even if we decided today or tomorrow that recycling is the way to go, the capacity that is required to carry out recycling for critical materials does not exist yet. But I think I read somewhere in the United States you have about three plants that could do recycling for critical materials, and there are 7 that are still in the pipeline, and they won't come on board at least for the next 5 to 10 years. So what happens with that capacity? I think we can do a lot more, not just offshoring, but maybe friendshoring with countries that are willing to work with the United States to do some of this critical work.
I feel like there's a theme that we've sort of landed on here in the last couple of comments, which is just like we're maybe doing better, but there's a lot more improvement needed, and that trend hopefully is going to continue. One aspect of that we haven't really talked about yet is like the operations of the mining industry itself. Mining is a energy and carbon intensive process. And it's something that if we're going to get to a net zero, carbon profile economy wide, we're going to have to figure out how to do, mining and recycling. Those things are going to have to happen in a decarbonized way. And Brandon, that's kind of why you're here at Fresh Energy,
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah, absolutely. I was going to say, let me jump in on this one. It's exactly, one of the main focuses of the industry department, and there are a variety of focuses there, but particularly in Minnesota, there's some great opportunities to decarbonize within the existing mining space. And the thing is the mining industry is typically considered a hard to abate sector, oftentimes because their operations are really complex. Aspects of their operations are very mobile, making it really hard to electrify. The mines are a living, breathing organism. They're evolving all the time, and it's you can't necessarily build infrastructure in one section of the mine, because that section will be moved to another section 2 weeks later, type of thing, right? So it's an ever evolving operation. It's a little different than a fixed source, a plant, and some of the other stuff we'll talk about is some of the other industries in Minnesota. But so those the mining operations, again, they're hard to abate. They're hard to electrify. There are other avenues that we can be looking at, different clean fuel sources. Really what we want to do is just focus on, incremental wins in that space and continue to grow on those opportunities. But long term, there are some bigger opportunities in Minnesota. And one of the concepts that we're talking about here today is green steel or clean steel. And today, at this current time, our Iron Range produces taconite that we ship off to other states where they do the actual steel making process. There is a cohort of people here in Minnesota that are advocating for a full cycle steel production, green steel production process here in Minnesota. So we mine the taconite and we do the steel production locally here as well. And that introduces a lot more opportunity to prevent waste, but also to plug and play in a system. If we're making advances on reducing the emissions related to the iron production side, we can also do that on the steel production side. And it's going to require a lot of complex infrastructure to get that done, but we can be kind of doubling up on those efforts a little bit. And it's a really exciting concept for Minnesota. It has a lot of upside potential, especially when we talk about some of the community impacts and in the labor market as well. So we're excited to be involved in that work and helping kind of drive that conversation a little bit with some of our partners here in Minnesota to make sure that the concept is being looked at holistically. Again, going back to that whole set of principles that we talked about, making sure that we're looking at it from every angle.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of there's heavy industry in Minnesota beyond mining too, right? Like we've talked a lot about mining in this podcast, but there's manufacturing, happening all over the state, even including in the energy sector, right? There's, Helene up on the Iron Range is doing, I believe it's the largest solar manufacturer in the United States, and that's like it's like literally immediately adjacent to the Iron Range, right? So that's pretty cool, and I think it's maybe kind of why we have a heavy industry department at Fresh Energy.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah. And there's a variety of other things that are, especially in that kind of traditionally focused as considered as hard to abate sectors. And another really important one is the concrete and cement space. A variety of challenges in that space, just coming down to basic chemistry of how these things are produced that there's no real viable substitute for these types of products as well. And these have really big knock-on effects to everything, not just the actual production of concrete and cement, but all of the downstream implications of it. And it's hard to decarbonize the building sector if you can't tackle this on the front end, right? So some really important work in that space as well. And then there are dozens of stationary facilities within Minnesota that also have large emissions that are related to more of their like low to medium heat processes. So the other hard to abate sectors we were talking about in steel production and everything, those are really high temperature processes, which makes them very hard to electrify again. But some of the low to medium process heat are areas that are really good candidates for electrification. And there's a variety of ways that we can get some of these facilities off of some of their gas boilers or furnaces or otherwise, and look at things like heat pumps or other ways to electrify their operations. And there's a lot of people here in the state that are doing really good work, kind of honing in on where are those opportunities and identifying these candidates and making some moves to electrify some of those things. And that really, within Minnesota, a few examples of that would be food processing facilities, some of the dairy sector, even things like breweries. So there is a larger portfolio that we'll be focusing on in the industry department. And some of these are considered a little bit more low-hanging fruit. Meanwhile, we're going to continue to be pushing, and it's not going to happen overnight, but we will continue to push on things like green steel, concrete, and cement as well.
That's awesome, Brandon. Sounds like there's just an incredible, both really big challenge and a lot of opportunity for Minnesota and elsewhere in this area. And it's really why this industry work bubbled up as part of our recently completed strategic planning, Vision 2030, which you can read about on the Fresh Energy website. If you look at the materials there, you'll see the industry department is something that's new for Fresh Energy and something that we're really newly committed to as part of our work to decarbonize the economy fully by mid-century. So really appreciate your thought leadership, Brandon, and look forward to seeing and hearing what comes next for this work. Kwezi, I want to come back to you. You've been, really thinking and researching in this area around mining and the energy transition for as we discussed, it's going on 6 months, and
Yeah.
your contributions have just been incredibly invaluable for Fresh Energy. Do you have any, as we sort of wrap up our discussion today, any big picture takeaways or closing thoughts?
Yeah, I think it's been, first of all, I thought you'd congratulate me upon surviving the Minnesota winter. So I did survive that.
Oh, it's a privilege to
Yes,
experience a Minnesota winter.
yes. Yeah, it's been an interesting time. I think the biggest takeaway for me was that coming from Uganda, being here in the United States for 1 year, sometimes you may not see the parallels or some of the similarities, but I think I've found a lot of similarities in happening, uh, what is happening here in the United States and what's happening back home. I think the energy transition is here, and that different countries are involved at different levels, but we're all aiming to solve the same challenge. I think for me, that's the biggest takeaway. Our approach might be different, but at the end of the day, the target is the same. I've also not just been tied to my work desk here at Fresh Energy or at the Humphrey School. I've also, weather allowing, managed to step out into the parks and travel the state, visit the state capital, and see how the policymaking process happens here. And it's been a wonderful experience to get an insight into how American democracy works. So I think for me, those are some of the lessons. The other thing that probably your listeners may not know is that Uganda is roughly the same size as Minnesota, and that we're also surrounded by a huge inland lake. It's called Lake Victoria, and we have I don't know, between the River Nile and River Mississippi, which one is the longest river in the world, but we also have a great river that literally cuts through half of our country. So it's been interesting seeing all these similarities being here in the Midwest. And I think what this emphasizes is the role international cooperation can play, especially in a sector like critical minerals and the energy transition. And also, at the end of the day, collaborations are not just about institutions talking to one another, but people talking to one another. So listening more to people that are involved in this work. So we've had interviews to talk to a few industry players here and there, but also people that are impacted by some of these sectors, to try and understand their grievances and the particular history they've had with some of these industries. So it's been a wonderful experience, and I'm enjoying the last few weeks in the Midwest, and enjoying some fine weather before I head back home.
And a couple weeks of good weather for you.
Oh yes.
Well, that's sort of we're kind of coming to the end here, guys. Any closing comments or final thoughts before we wrap up our conversation today from either of you?
Yeah, just appreciate the opportunity to have a space to have challenging discussions like this, and I hope that people are listening to this and again recognizing, like you said up top, Justin, we're not advocating for any particular projects or anything. We're not saying go mine, mine, mine. We're simply kind of pointing out that this is a challenge and we need to have a real discussion around it to see how we can do better and the advancements are going to happen over time. We're kind of forced to work with what we've got, but yeah, I remain optimistic that we can take this and find some solutions.
Yeah, Justin, for me, I think maybe 13 years ago when I was doing my undergraduate in chemistry, and I had this class where we're looking at the periodic table. I never thought there would come a day when uh, the periodic table would be useful outside of my class. And increasingly nowadays, when you read the news, sometimes you feel like printing out your periodic table and and having a look at it. So it's amazing the possibilities that lie ahead and what we can do with some of these materials. And my hope is that we can continue to see more investments going into this space uh, to find as many possibilities as possible that would lead us to this 2050 net zero target.
Well said, both of you, and thank you both for taking the time to have this conversation. It's a tricky topic, and I think challenging for a lot of us locally that uh, have different perspectives and like lived experiences with mining, with heavy industry, and I think Brandon, really looking forward to seeing the growth of the industry department. Kwezi, we're just so grateful for your time and work with us, and really wish you the best of luck as you move on to your next steps and some well-deserved time back at home. So really appreciate you both. And really appreciate you listening at home. Thank you so much for subscribing to Decarbonize, the Clean Energy Podcast from Fresh Energy. You can stay up to date on Fresh Energy's work at fresh-energy.org or follow us on social media. Head to our website for the latest news from Fresh Energy to make a donation and register for upcoming events. Speaking of events, we hope that you can join us this July 15th for the Fresh Frolic, our all-electric party at the Trailhead at Theodore Wirth Park. It's going to be an absolute blast, and we hope to see you there. Thank you to the band Palm Psalm for providing our theme song DGAF off their album Otuhaka. Get the latest from the band at palmpsalm.com. Thank you so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time on Decarbonize.